There we go. All right.
What are you doing for your birthday, Brian?
Oh, this morning, Shaylin made some brunch for some guys came over for brunch. So it was nice. Yeah.
I guess that's a happy birthday call.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. And then I also, of course, like I got to hang out with your awesome husband for discipleship group as well. So that's on the birthday highlight list for sure. I know it is 5:30. I think we can wait a couple more minutes as people are trickling in. If that's okay.
Sure, no problem.
A few folks did say they would be a little late, and then others said they might not make it, but they'll watch the recording for sure. So, oh, good. We got
Wise, yeah, I think this is what you were just talking about, but
We've
there's some
decided to
people
band
who
together.
are gonna be trickling in.
Anybody who was on the praise team is going, and their spouses will be trickling in.
Where are you guys? Is that the library?
Nope.
No, it's a church.
The
church,
choir.
choir room. All right. Yeah.
By the way, since people are gonna be late on our end, I know some other people are trickling in too. Feel free to start.
I think we're ready
whenever.
to start.
Okay, sure. I think we have a good mass, so we can probably get going.
Yeah.
I could maybe just briefly for everyone introduce Amy and Jane, who are on the call with us from Carson Homes for Refugees. Amy, I believe, is the director.
Program director.
Program director. Okay, great. And then Jane is a volunteer with the organization. So thank you both for joining us tonight, and feel free to take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for having us. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because we have a presentation to kind of walk through what is community sponsorship and how are the ways that we're working with communities in our area. So I'm going to go ahead and try out my screen share. Is it working? Can you see my screen? Okay, great. All right, so thank you. Oops, and it's not March 13th, but March 13th, but here we are. So thanks again for having us. And I want to start by telling you a little bit about the history of our organization, which was, in 2015, when we all saw these terrible images coming out of Syria and the Mediterranean of people that were forced from their homes. There were a number of people around in Westchester, the founder of Hearts and Homes for Refugees being one of them, who said, there's got to be something we can do here to help those people. And Kathy O'Callahan is the founder. And so the idea was, finding that local solution to this global crisis. What was it that we might be able to do? What is the crisis? There's over 80 million people around the world that have been displaced from their homes, forced from their homes. And 26 million of those are refugees. We're going to talk in a couple minutes about what does it mean to be a refugee exactly. And 40% of those are kids And I think really importantly, less than 1% of them will ever be resettled. Less than 1% will ever find a permanent home like the folks that have arrived to the United States. So the people who make it here are the cases that are the most dire. They're often survivors of torture or have been just in incredibly dangerous situations and have no option of ever being able to return home. These are the cases that are the ones that make it to the United States. And so I think it's just important to remember that as well, because as impossible of a situation as it is for any refugee, the ones who make it here have made it past even more obstacles and hardships. And so what we created was a grassroots organization based in the community using volunteers to resettle refugees and build a longer welcoming table, one family at a time. And we want to empower refugees in building their new lives. So our focus is really to stand shoulder to shoulder with refugees, empower them with dignity and hope, and seeing how much goodwill that there is in the community. We want to tap into that. We know it's out there. So this is just a way to tap into it, organize ourselves, and take advantage of the networks that exist and build new ones or strengthen them in order to support refugees as they arrive. So as I mentioned, we'll talk about, what is exactly a refugee. And so it's a refugee is a person outside of his or her home country who's unable or unwilling to return to that country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution. And it's based, might be based on ethnicity or belonging to a certain political group, or perhaps being an activist or being LGBTQ. So there's many reasons that they cannot return, and refugees are vetted. They're screened more intensively than any other group arriving into the United States. So normally the process is that refugees are registered with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency, and then they go through processing with the United States National Counterterrorism Center, FBI, Department of Defense, State, Homeland Security. Occasionally, they are not referred by the UN Refugee Agency, but they come straight from our own embassies and consulates overseas, where certain individuals and families are identified within the US Embassy for resettlement. This process of vetting can take years. Many refugees live in a state of flux for those years. Some never get to leave a refugee camp in their entire lifetime. Those who are approved by the United States for resettlement then get referred to one of the 9 resettlement agencies in the country. So these are HIAS, Catholic Charities, the IRC, and others who provide the basic services to assist them in restarting their lives here. Us as an organization, we work in partnership with the resettlement agencies. We're like an extension of their services. We'll talk more about that. So an asylee is the principle is the same as a refugee. They're unable or unwilling to return to their home country because of persecution or well-founded fear thereof, but they first arrive into the United States and then make that declaration, and that's where they receive the status. And that's why we all know about asylum seekers. They're here waiting for their case to be heard and processed before they're granted asylum. But it's just the same level of danger, just one is given their status while still overseas, the other is given their status once they're inside the United States. We always like to reiterate and point out that the right to seek and be granted asylum was guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted in 1948, and the US was a leader in the effort to draft it and in getting it adopted by the United Nations. So it has been historically an area where the United States has been a leader. Right now, however, there's like approximately 670,000 asylum seekers waiting for their hearings to resolve their cases in a severely backlogged system. And current wait times for cases average nearly 4.5 years, which leaves asylum seekers in the US in limbo for a very long time. There's another path to arrival in this country, which is through the Special Immigrant Visa Program, SIV. And this is a specific program for wartime allies from Iraq and Afghanistan. They have risked their lives working alongside our troops and our government officials as interpreters, translators, drivers, engineers, project managers. They work at our embassies and on US funded projects. They might have been working on construction or women's education, but because of this service to the United States, they and their families were targeted by insurgents. The program for Iraq has been closed. It no longer exists, but I'm sure you're aware that the SIV program is alive and well for Afghanistan. Well, it's alive. I wouldn't say it's well because by law, this SIV application process should be adjudicated within 9 months, but on average, it takes 2 or 3 years or longer. People are, again, waiting in limbo. And as we know, there were so many of the applicants whose cases have not finished processing who've been left behind in Afghanistan. Right now, there's a fourth category of refugees. If we use the umbrella term refugees, there's a fourth category of folks in the United States, which are the humanitarian parolees from Afghanistan. And this was a rarely used program. Humanitarian parole was generally used like if you have somebody that needs urgent medical care and they come to the United States, receive the treatment, and they go back home. So it's a temporary status. It was normally granted for a year. Thankfully, they've extended it for 2 years for the Afghans that have arrived, but there isn't going to be any way for them to go back home. Things aren't going to be resolved within 2 years. So it's not a permanent status for building the future in the United States. The folks that have arrived need to have their status adjusted. Some of them are eligible for the special immigrant visa and are applying. Others are applying for asylum. But this could, as we just said, the process for asylum can take 4 years, and this status that they have is only 2 years. The volume, our system's already broken. So how is this going to actually play out? Right now, there are many lawmakers that are considering the Afghan Adjustment Act. This would be an adjustment, a mass adjustment of status as a group that would prevent the Afghans from being deported or losing their jobs while their immigration petitions are working their way through the bureaucracy. This isn't unheard of. This happened for Haitians, for Cubans, I think the Vietnamese, where these acts went through and everybody got an adjustment of status. So there will be more advocacy throughout the summer on this Afghan Adjustment Act, and we hope that everyone will participate in really asking for this really important piece of legislation. So how many people arrived? There were 76,000 Afghans airlifted to the US since August 2021. So if you were following closely, you might know that there were like 120,000 something people who came out. Some of them were US citizens, diplomats from other countries that we took out. So the Afghans were 76,000. They've been processed, vetted, vaccinated, and they are now, as you probably know from the news, all outside of the military bases and resettling across the United States. 44% of those children, 46,000 of them are in the process of applying for special immigrant visas, but countless Afghans remain behind.
Amy, excuse me, I don't know whether you're moving papers as you speak or if somebody else is, but as we're listening to you, I'm hearing a lot of background noise. I don't know if anybody else is.
Yeah, I don't know, because I wasn't touching my papers, but maybe I'll just move them in case somehow it was creating while I was talking.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. Hearts and Homes for Refugees is part of the Afghan EVAC Coalition, which is a group of over 100 organizations who got together after, in September, kind of gathered together, formed a coalition. We also participate in the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition. And so, we are really trying to amplify the voices that are out there advocating for these Afghans, the ones who are still there and the ones who have arrived. while they are all out of the camps now, there are still families that are waiting to find their permanent homes. They're in temporary accommodations. And evacuations are continuing. Right now, evacuations are mostly continuing out of Pakistan. So people that have made their way to Pakistan and have their visas all processed and are going out. There was a flight that went out, I think, on Friday. So now that was part of why it was so urgent to get the camps cleared, because there's more people coming. So we will continue to see people from Afghanistan arriving. And then, of course, there's people arriving from other places in the world too. So the way that Hearts and Homes supports refugees, we have our 4 mandates to building our welcoming communities. We welcome. This is the direct action with refugees. But we also convene others to share our knowledge, our resources, our expertise, and our volunteer opportunities, and learn from one another. We educate the general public about the plight of refugees and also understanding the situation. We do this by going into schools. We have reading lists. We participate in community festivals, trying to spread the word about refugees. And we advocate, as I mentioned, most recently advocating for the special immigrant visas and for the Afghan Adjustment Act, but always advocating for increased acceptance and protection of refugees. I'm going to turn it over to Jane now, talk a little more specifically about what we do to welcome.
Thank you. So I got involved personally with this as part of one of the community sponsorship groups that started in 2016. And that is where most of my time and passion are to be found. But as Hearts and Homes grew and became kind of, it coordinates, it's an umbrella organization that brings us all together. I have wanted to look at the bigger picture, not just community sponsorship of our group, but that is really my background of community sponsorship, which means that a group of congregations, civic groups, individuals have come together and decided that they can find both the human capacity, the human resources, and the financial capacity to support a family who have come as refugees to the United States. And I'm going to use the word family, but one of the things I think we can point out is that when you offer to support somebody for their first year here, it could be a family, and some of the families are large, 4, 5, 6 children, but it could also be a couple or a single, an individual. So when groups are forming and they're looking at the possibility of community sponsorship, I think it's important to bear in mind that if you don't think you have the resources for a family of 8, you may have the resources for a single or a young couple. Okay, Amy, next one.
Sorry, 1 second.
Okay. So what we're calling now, it's in the past, it's had different names, hosting, sponsoring, but right now we are talking about calling it community sponsorship. So it's a local solution. It is absolutely volunteer driven. We are all volunteers. Hearts and Homes has many, many hundreds of volunteers. The resettlement group that I work with has 300 volunteers. They aren't all volunteering and doing stuff at the same time, but they have signed up saying we're interested in helping, and they jump in whenever it works for them. So they are community supported partnerships. One of the things that has been most exciting for me over these 6, almost 7 years has been the fact that we have all gotten to know each other. So my community sponsor group knows the other ones. We reach out to one another if there's something, a question that we have or something that we can't supply. We're reaching out to Hearts and Homes. We're reaching out to other resettlement groups. It's an amazing partnership. And it also actually creates a lot of new friendships that wouldn't have started without the fact that we're all working together for the same goal. I think I mentioned earlier, but maybe it was before the Zoom started. They are groups of local faith and interfaith congregations, civic groups, schools, other community partners, any place where you can get people together who want to work towards supporting a family. You can put your own group together. There is training, and I think that's really important. We are dealing with people who have had trauma in their lives, who come from cultures that are very different. So community volunteers and neighbors get trained. And I guess it's a way of saying that we provide a very strong network for one another. Amy, anything you want to add, or next slide? And you should always show a picture, because you should show the human face to this. I just love looking at the pictures and seeing this is what we're talking about. It's not just words, it's people. So when you agree to take care of a family, you kind of start from the fact that they may be coming with nothing. They may know nothing about what they're getting themselves into coming to a new country. And so this community sponsor group needs to be prepared to give them support and assistance in each of these areas that are listed here: housing, community orientation, employment, ESOL support, education for the children, family budgeting and finance, the government services and utilities, healthcare, driving, volunteer coordination. It is, in the beginning, a 24/7 on-call kind of job. And then as the family gets more independent, they have more agency over themselves, and the responsibility of the volunteers decreases. But no matter what your training is, there are always things that come up. And no matter what the families are being shown, they're going to have questions of things that you can't anticipate. You can imagine, as we make our phone calls to our health insurance companies or the government to ask about a tax check that hasn't been received or something, how many calls it takes, and people give you different answers and you have to check it out. Imagine doing that when you don't have any familiarity with the system, and you may not understand the person at the other end. They may not understand you. So even though the responsibilities of the volunteers get less over time, there are things that come up well into the year and sometimes beyond a year. Next slide.
So this model of community sponsorship, which I would say has very much been embraced in Westchester County, and now we've seen that it's becoming embraced across the country. The U.S. government is also proposing these sponsorship circles for areas where there are not resettlement agencies, and it's really shifting the paradigm of refugee resettlement. So in the lower Hudson Valley, over 80 Afghan refugees resettled and assisted just in September. That's more than 20 families, and refugees are also coming from other countries. We have a new single from Myanmar, a family from Honduras, families from Guatemala, and families will continue to be welcomed throughout 2022 and of course beyond. Building community is really part of what Hearts and Homes is striving to do. So we're scaling up, increasing the volunteers and resettlement of refugees ourselves with groups that are underneath us. And we always also love to collaborate. As Jane has mentioned, she's part of a different resettlement team that has resettled 3 families, and one of those, Hearts and Homes, collaborated with her group. Her group was called the Interfaith Council for New Americans Westchester, ICNA, and we've collaborated with them as well as other groups that are around the county, River Towns for Refugees, Austining for Refugees, etc. And we've also helped to form teams of congregations and groups that didn't know each other before that are now on teams underneath Hearts and Homes. I participate in one of those. So I belong to kind of a smallish church myself that back in 2019, we welcomed a single, and we had about 50, maybe 50 people on our volunteer list. But the reality is that there were about 6 or 7 of us that were really active with this case. And at the 6-month mark, the person was completely financially self-sufficient and doing well. You know, as Jane mentioned, there are certain things where, you know, you require assistance because, you know, maybe the person wants to find a new job or needs to change health insurance, or, you know, has a question about benefits or taxes that's really hard to navigate as a newcomer, especially depending on the English skills, where you continue to provide support. But the financial support, you know, we strive for everyone to be financially self-sufficient by the end of the 6 months. In addition to resettling families, we also help with home apartment setups, and we've been working on those in households mostly in the city, so in Queens and the Bronx, where the resettlement agencies say, okay, we know that, you know, this is out of your neighborhood, so you can't provide all the community sponsorship, but can you help us to set up an apartment? That's what I was just talking about. So usually in those cases, you get matched, you know, with a newly arrived refugee, and then there's a list of what furniture is needed, and also, you know, usually some kind of online wish list of items that need to be purchased new, like the pillows and the sheets and the paper towels and toilet paper that need to be purchased new. So that's another way to work with Hearts and Homes in welcoming families and individuals. Jane?
Yeah. So this work, and I hesitate to call it work because it is so inspiring and fulfilling. But when you volunteer, there are both joys and challenges. So if you're taking the family to a park or taking the children to a zoo or on a trip, maybe registering them for school, that's very rewarding and fulfilling, and it's a joy. But if you look at the other picture that Amy is in, just to show you that she does some of the grunt work also, there are also challenges. So cleaning an apartment or lugging all the things that have to be brought up 2 flights of stairs to that apartment isn't always joyful. It's a challenge, but it's important work. And I said to Amy before we got started, one of the things that I would say is that when I talk to volunteers, I kind of remind them that we're volunteering to help and meet the needs of a family that has endured horrendous experiences. If we feel good about it, that's a great bonus. And I don't know anybody who who's done something that hasn't felt good about it. But volunteering needs to be about the need of the family, not necessarily the need for us to feel good. But there are many, many opportunities to feel just great about volunteering in this area. Next slide. So one of the, Amy, you'll have to remind me how far I'm going to go on this, so let me know when my slides are up.
Okay.
Employment support is obviously a big one, and it comes with a lot of challenges. How well does the person speak English? Do the skills and the work that they did in their home country translate to things that they can do here? Do they understand that first jobs are often menial and low paying, and they may not be able to get the kind of work that they're used to? But we have, and this is a really great example of how we've all learned to share. My group, ICNA, had an incredible chair of our employment committee. And over the years, we have shared him. He has broadened his scope so that he now works the employment committee for Hearts and Homes as well. And we said to other groups that were just starting, you know, if you're not sure where to begin, we have somebody who really has this down pat. And so we have been able to share all of our expertise. Next slide. Another area is language support, and I will tell you that I am looking at 3 of our children from ICNA. I always say I'm the American grandma to these. Language support has many variations. Online tutoring, ESL conversation partners, while the dads usually come with English, functional English, because that's how they were connected to the military or the government. The mothers very often have limited education and very limited English, not all the time, but frequently. And the children, of course, it is unlikely that they've been exposed to much English. So we do both formal language training and just social conversation. But a lot of times, especially during COVID, when the kids were on Zoom for school, you know, we were doing remote work also. So we would do fun and games and virtual learning. The women are generally the ones that feel the most isolated. So we started a women's weekly meetup, and it had been going on in English only, but now we actually have two kind of parallel groups. There's a group for those who are more fluent in English, and there's another group for women who are not fluent in English, but need to visit and chat with one another and socialize. So the women's weekly meetup is something that's dear to my heart. Amy, next one. And it's you. Back to you.
So in addition to, you know, having these volunteer teams doing community sponsorship that are match specific to a family, Hearts and Homes has other complementary support of refugees. So, you know, back to school drive. So all the families, not just the new arrivals, but supporting folks that have been here maybe a year or two. Back to school drive in the summer. We've hosted winter coats and boots drives. We also accept donations of vehicles that we match to families as they're able and able to take on the responsibility of ownership of a car. And as you know, in Westchester, that can be an incredible boon. We do have public transportation, but having your own vehicle is a great next step. We also have drives for personal care products and distributions. We're working with collaborating with the Upper Westchester Muslim Society on grocery distribution every 2 weeks. So there's a lot of complementary support that a community sponsorship team doesn't have to provide themselves. They can tap into these ongoing programs that we can help them with. And then there is so much that is, you know, given directly to the refugees in other forms: bicycles, televisions, phones, furniture. So many things that it's very that we're able to receive in donations, some new and some like new, and to share with our new refugee neighbors. And that's a really significant amount of our support for refugees. It's not just what we pay for ourselves, but also the donations that come through the volunteers and the volunteer teams. But of course, cash is always an important part of the work we do, because, you know, it's cash that pays the rent. So, you know, donations to Hearts and Homes can help to pay the rent, pay for the groceries, while we assist families in signing up for SNAP, for example. In the time that they arrive, there's usually a lag 2-3 months before they receive their SNAP benefits. And Hearts and Homes for Refugees covers their groceries when they arrive. Some schools have Chromebooks, but some of them, the Chromebooks that are given are not very good, or somebody might be a student, you know, learning English and does, you know, an adult student, and so doesn't have a Chromebook. So those are something we can purchase, or the winter coats and boots, etc. So that's also a really important part of our work. And so, you know, here we are kind of in this incredible point in time where, after 4 years under the previous administration of the US refugee program really being shut down, we're building back, and it's a heavy lift. And then it became exponentially larger because of the events in August in Afghanistan. But there's just really so much hope right now and so much energy, and we're really excited to be here, you know, with you. I mean, I guess very appropriate, New Hope, the name of your group, because we're really excited about what the future looks like for our new neighbors, and really believe that together we can welcome families and help them on the road to self-sufficiency. So thank you. I'm going to stop my sharing, and we would be more than happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you guys for that presentation. It was very helpful. I do have some questions myself, but if others have some questions, I can wait since I've already had some chances to ask questions before.
Hey, Jane,
Yes.
as a volunteer, what are some unforeseeable problems that we might come across that I know that might be good to prepare for? I know we can't prepare for everything, but what are some things that you notice that are common?
It's hard. It's hard to think. Amy, you can help me if you want. Because we really haven't had problems, at least not in the families that I've dealt with. And we actually have done 5, Amy, rather than 3.
Oh, yeah, sorry, of course.
So I guess that's okay. That's all right. I would say the one that jumps to mind, because it's really hard for me to think of what ended up being the problem, but the one that came to mind first was a family that a family of 4 that we took care of that has now relocated. His paperwork and the information we had before he arrived was that he spoke English quite well. And when he arrived, that in fact was not accurate. He had very little English. The English he had was not understandable. In terms of HIAS, at one of the agency that placed him was HIAS. One of the things HIAS is aware of is that Westchester is expensive. And so we were told that they did try and identify refugees who might have either the English or the skills to be able to compete in a county like Westchester rather than upstate. And that probably was not true for this family. They were a lovely family. The mother had not spent 1 day in a classroom. She did not know how to hold a pencil or which way the paper should be turned. Dad had only had, I think it was up to 4th grade maybe, of education. So he didn't have much general education, but certainly his English was very limited. So that became a major challenge in terms of finding employment. So that's the biggest one. Other than that, the families, they've already been so brave to be willing to come here that things that you think might be a challenge, like putting your child on a school bus for the first time and not knowing very much, about what's going to happen when he leaves. Well, we anticipated that was going to be difficult. It wasn't difficult. And Dad was crying when that child came home from school because it was the first time that he knew his child was going to come home from school. He didn't have to worry about whether his child would be killed during the day. So yeah, I can't think of problems really. There are cultural differences, right? There are definitely cultural differences. Oh, I know, I can think of one. I wouldn't call it a problem, but it was something that I think we weren't as aware of as we could have been, which is that planning and time, being on time for things is not as familiar. So I would make a plan for the end of the week, and then by the end of the week it wasn't possible because they had something else going on and they didn't realize, but I planned. We kept our time free. We arranged for a driver, and the idea of those kinds of commitments. So we both I had to give a little and they had to understand that it was important to volunteers to let them know when something wasn't going to come off as planned. Other than that, Amy, what problems do you think we need to be aware of it?
I think, in terms of what you might expect, what we always say is expect the unexpected. There's always something that new that comes up, and it can feel like you're zigging and zagging because, you think you're going great and then something comes up and it's like, wait, we've got to pivot, and then you have to pivot and then you have to pivot. But there's this ongoing, like, somehow it all works out and you overcome those. I mean, just like all of us in our lives overcome the things that come up, and they're not always easy to deal with. So I actually had a call yesterday. So-and-so has not been feeling well for 3 days, and she hadn't told, they hadn't told us, and she, an increasingly splitting headache, needs to go to the ER. her insurance has not come through. So, you know, we have to figure out, okay, where do we take somebody who doesn't currently have insurance? How do we handle this? Who's going to pick them up from the hospital? You know, but yet, you know, it all worked out. She was discharged. She's okay. I don't, you know, and we were able to find a driver that could take her and a driver that could come and pick her up at the end. You know, you get through it. It is intensive at the beginning, and that's why having a good team is so important, because things come up and, you know, sure, you and I might say, well, you can hop in an Uber, but for somebody who doesn't speak the language and isn't familiar for the system, you know, that's what we're there to do, right? Find a volunteer that can accompany them on that. I also want to add, you know, that right now the circumstances are a little bit different than they had been in the past, where, you know, Jane was talking about receiving information, a limited amount of information about the family before they arrive. Of course, with the Afghan arrivals who've been on the bases, we've had the chance actually to meet several of the clients before they arrived to Westchester. So we were able to say, for example, there was a family that had no income earner. It was like a disabled child, and so the parent had to stay home with the disabled child, so there was not going to be any income earner. And so the resettlement agency asked about the possibility, and we had to sadly say, you know, we don't think Westchester is going to be the right fit for this family. They need to be perhaps in the city where there's even more services, public services, and easier transportation and all those things. And so, you know, we do have a little bit more information, sometimes even are able to meet the family. And it's not just Afghans, of course. I mean, that's what the focus has been on lately, but, you know, there are families coming from Central America in particular, in which case that also changes everything, because you can easily get by with Spanish only in Westchester. So while we continue to, of course, work on ESOL with our recently arrived family from Honduras, for example, you can immediately find a job just working in Spanish. You know, you can find that first job somewhere. So it's really about also finding the right match the family for Westchester, and finding the volunteer team, and kind of making sure that this is all going to work so that the families are successful when they arrive.
I was wondering if you guys could speak to just the training and what that involves, maybe particularly highlighting some of the cultural aspects of training.
So we have a training on volunteer best practices. And as Jane mentioned before, you know, people come with a lot of trauma. It's also about how to provide what we call trauma-informed care, and being sensitive to that. And we touch on cultural differences, but for Afghans in particular, we have an additional cultural orientation just to kind of learn a little bit more, because the culture is quite different, and we have background information that people can read and that kind of thing, to help everybody get prepared. I will add, you know, I've seen so much effort on the part of volunteers, which is great, wanting to be sensitive. And I also see families wanting to understand the culture, and they also receive cultural orientation through the resettlement agencies. And then, of course, community sponsors add to that by repeating things about arriving on time, which is a huge issue, arriving on time and making a schedule, you know, I mean, like, we're so into our orderliness about that, those kinds of things in the United States. So it comes from both ends. And so what I was going to say is that, you know, the refugees are also receiving this training, and they're also eager to, like, find their way here. So generally things, you know, they work out well. People are making their best efforts and are able to understand one another, and, you know, not have, you know, offensive things happen between, you know, in terms of cultural differences, and really knowing that everybody's acting in the best interest. But we do have, you know, both, well, it's all webinar now. Training.
I think another thing I think is part of the training, which would be the training that any volunteer gets at any agency, you know, in terms of respect and confidentiality and giving agency to the client and stuff. So there's some generic pieces to the training as well.
Mm-hmm.
I have a quick question. I think Amy, you had said that in times when you've done resettlement with a family that you usually have 15 people on the roster, but it's really like 6 or 7 people that are often doing a lot of the kind of most immediate response. What would you say is the ideal number of people to have in terms of like the most flexibility, you know, like maybe 5 people that are really open and then another like 5 people that could maybe help out with additional advance notice?
Yeah. So what I said about 6 or 7 being active, that was on the team for my church, and it was 50 was on our total roster, 50, and that was for a single. And actually, you know, having 5 to 7 people on a team for a single is a good number. For a big family, you're going to need 8 to 12, I would say, for your core team, and then your secondary tier of volunteers is already going to need to be much more active. You know, we have another single right now that we're working on, and it's like 7 people, and we don't have a secondary roster. Like everybody between those 7, we can manage everything. But when you have a family and you're talking about dentist appointments and medical appointments which are numerous at the beginning, and going in, enrolling, registering at the school, and doing this and that, then you really need to have a good 20 people that can be pretty active. Would you say that's an accurate or fair, Jane? What would you say?
Yeah, I was yes, I think you're right. And one of the ways maybe to look at it is if you look at each of the committees, that it's most of the resettlement agencies have the same kind of, if they're doing community sponsorship, they have the same kind of what am I the word looking for, outline for how to do it. So everybody will say, you need to have an employment committee, you need to have a healthcare committee, you need to have an education committee. Well, if you think about that, then you can figure out, oh, for the employment committee, yes, there's a lead person, but maybe you want to have 2 or 3 others, one who has some experience in HR, one who's well connected locally. So if you look at each of the committees and think for each of those committees, you should have a few people that are really, really active. And then for things like driving, it could be a one-off. There's somebody who works a 9-to-5 job still during the week, but is happy to say, oh, okay, but I could run them to a soccer game on Saturday. That's the only way they can help. They're still working long hours themselves, but they could do something on a weekend or during a holiday or something. So it's really nice to have a large number of people who will do the one-off stuff. But you've got to have some people that are, pretty much want to be available, weekly. They may have something to do at least once a week. And the key people are doing something, not every day, but almost every day in the beginning.
I thought of one other thing that I would add about something that maybe one wouldn't necessarily expect, but it has come up often with the families from Afghanistan in particular, is dental work. I mean, this is just a beast because there's no fluoride in the water in Afghanistan, and the dental care needs have been enormous when people arrive because they usually have been neglecting their teeth and need to see a dentist right away. And unfortunately, that's on Medicaid-based insurance. It's a complicated thing. And so I think that's something that you might not expect to be spending so much time on it, but that comes up.
Right, and the women really are not comfortable with male doctors, so then it's trying to, within the parameters that you already have, trying to see if you can get a female doctor. I will say, in general, when we're talking about sponsoring the family, one of the things that I talk to people about is whatever you can get donated, that's where we go first. So we go for donations first, and then when we can't get something donated, well, then I'll go out to larger. If I can't get it done within my group, then I go out to all our networking and I say, well, do you have it? We can't find the sewing machine this week, but does anybody know where there's a sewing machine? But after that, then you're talking about, maybe having to expend some funds on it. And the other thing, and this has come up, everybody I think has met a volunteer who so badly wants to help that they want to buy the thing. Let me buy them this and buy them that. And I've been pretty intense with volunteers in terms of we meet needs, not wants. The family needs to have an understanding of the difference. We don't have the funding, and even if we did, that funding should go to the next new family to make it possible for another family to come, not because we bought you a MacBook Pro or something.
And that's one of the things that also is covered in the volunteer orientation. You know, it's this over giving and over assisting, you know, and, you know, similar to, you know, buying too much, you might also be helping too much. You know, if they're never filling out their own paperwork, they never will fill out their own paperwork, you know, so, you know, kind of guiding people the way that you would to anybody to become totally independent. They need to learn how to do things for themselves. And so that's a really important point in volunteering.
Just curious, like it seems like there's like a general training for everyone, like the orientation that you mentioned. Is there also specific, whether it's during the orientation or separately for each committee, like more specific training in regards to, yeah, how those sort of like categories of service are broken up?
So Homes for Refugees has these volunteers like Gene Tozzi, the employment guru, that he meets then and talks to you, normally the lead employment volunteer from your team. And we have somebody that can guide on, you know, enrolling in benefits and government services, you know, so that's where this relationship between the volunteer team and Hearts and Homes as a group, you know, we can provide this back and forth of guidance and mentorship on the different aspects you do face them. And also we have, you know, somebody that's done a lot of household furnishing and apartment setups. And so, you know, they're there to support you. And I also wanted to mention, building on what Jane was saying about like asking in one's group for things and then asking larger, you know, for example, if you're going to furnish a household. And so first you put out in your church newsletter about like, okay, we're looking for these donations, but then you might want to post it on your local Facebook group or ask at the, you know, your friends outside of the church. It's not only a great way to get the things you need, but it's also a great way to like raise awareness about, you know, what you're doing and the work and welcoming refugees. It's a way to, you know, spread the word about welcoming at the same time.
Thank you.
I had a quick follow-up question to one of Jane's comments. You mentioned sort of for volunteers that it can be like challenging for someone working a 9 to 5 versus someone who's not. Do you think that there's I guess a certain number of people who might be needed who aren't, like who would be available on a weekday versus like people working in a 9 to 5 job?
Yeah, so that was something that when my group first started, some co-chairs were chosen because they were the first ones to volunteer. A co-chair who worked in downtown Manhattan with an intense job. That person couldn't really oversee the work that needed to be done those first months when the family came. So, you know, it's mostly us retired folks. Some families that have children that are in school that at least allows them to have time between, you know, 9 and 3 or whatever. But you need people who are available during the day. Is that the question you were asking? Does that meet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the question I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to know that you've got people that are available during the day most of the time. You can have a lot of these other people, but do you agree, Amy? I mean, I don't know what
Yeah, I mean, I
do.
think there's certain roles that the people who are working full time definitely fulfill, you know, through weekly meetings, somebody that's really doing the volunteer coordination, you know, puts out the request when you're like, oh, we need a drivers per X, and then they put out the request. So they're like online. And some people do that during the workday or in the evenings, you know, or taking notes at your meeting and maintaining the list of what needs to be done for the family and making sure it gets done, you know, that can be done. We have somebody that works entirely remotely with us on it, helping to enroll people in their benefits, you know, because you can do that online, a lot of it. But that person, for example, although they're online, they're able to make calls during the day to the benefits office. So, you know, if you're at least available during lunch, that helps. If it's only evenings and weekends, then as Jane mentioned, that can be a great driver for a one-off. But you definitely need for a lot of the team to have flexibility. They might be working. We do have people who are working, but have flexible schedules. And that can enable them to be able to make that once a week appointment with the family, or once every 2 weeks, you know, depending on what their role is. But especially at the beginning, the first 2-3 months are very intense with the family, and you need to have enough people that have time to meet with them so that their needs can get met. I don't know, again, it goes back to how many people on a team should have that kind of availability, depends on the family size. So whether it's 5 or 8 or 10, it, you know, depends on the family size. So that would be something important to know about yourselves as a group, so that you can think about, you know, how much can you take on?
Yeah, I think that'll definitely be an important thing to consider.
And I think that it's also, you know, just another point, you know, we did talk when I spoke with you guys in the smaller group before, you know, about these arriving families from Central America. That's very different. It's much easier to connect them to community services as well. So for example, when you're working with an Afghan family and perhaps a mom with 5 kids and 2 of them are under 5 and she wants to stay home with them because they're babies, then you need to have an ESOL tutor that should be a female that can come to the house. And so then you need like a team of 5 female tutors so that somebody can come every day, you know, so that can be very intensive. Well, if it's a Spanish speaking mom with kids in high school, she can just, you know, when they're in school, she goes to the local class. A lot of those are geared more towards Spanish speakers. So it's much easier. So that's a factor as well. And you don't necessarily need to accompany them to as many doctor's appointments either. The first time, helping them to get set up, and then after that, you know, you go to a doctor's office and there's the receptionist who might be bilingual. You know, if you're at something like Open Door Medical Care where they really are catering to Spanish speakers, so it makes everything a lot easier. So that's a factor to consider as well. We also have these people coming from Myanmar, a couple of recent arrivals, women fluent in English. I mean, you know, fully fluent, college educated, run their own businesses. That's a different lift, you know. So there is basically something for everybody. You tell us how much you can take on and we'll find a case that meets your ability.
Kind of along that line, I was wondering how you kind of manage the quality of the volunteers and the work that's being done, and if there's any issues, how do you rectify that, and how do you monitor that?
I see Jane nodding along. You want to start, Jane?
It's a really good question. Personally, I have not had a lot of issues. Our volunteers we meet with our volunteers first before they get started. So some of the things we've been talking about tonight, we would be talking about with them as well. And there are very few. I've had the experience of one volunteer driver who missed 3 appointments, wasn't where she was supposed to be to pick up a family, or was late or forgot, whatever. You know, and then nicely, we just kind of moved on to other drivers, and she didn't get, when I put out the request, her name wasn't always on the email distribution list, because I couldn't leave a 4-year-old waiting at nursery school for a driver that didn't come. I guess probably I'm the gatekeeper on some of the gifting. So people see, I do coordinate the volunteers for our resettlement group. So people will call me and say, oh, you know, I really think we need to get a laptop for so-and-so. And, you know, and I can buy it. I'd like to donate a lot. And I said, you know, we would like to go through the process of looking for a donation first. And I just play the heavy on that kind of thing. We have not had, I think the most worrisome kind of scenario would be, you know, a volunteer who didn't respect the family's privacy or was insensitive to something that they were going through. And to the best of my knowledge, we have not encountered that. If that's happened, it has not been reported by the family or witnessed by anybody else. So it has not, for me, it has not been much of an issue.
And that's part of, you know, where the training comes in and the discussion of confidentiality and boundaries that, you know, before you start working. Also, we run background checks on volunteers when you sign up. There is, particularly in the first 3 months, when you limit the interaction of the family to a smaller group of volunteers while they're getting their bearings and getting settled. And then, you know, trying to really rely on that smaller group that you've done a background check and a driver's check. And then, you know, after 3 months, you can kind of open up a little bit and the family can have a better sense of making their own decisions. But right at the beginning, we're making the decisions about, yes, this person's kind of picked you up and you don't know them. So that's why it's really important, these background checks. And then for the teams that are Hearts and Homes teams, we, you know, have weekly volunteer team meetings to discuss the family. And so either Kathy or I are with that in that, you know, team meeting to say, you know, see how things are going and following them up on things. So also, you know, it's not just that if you do this through Hearts and Homes, you're not just on your own. You would have somebody following the case and your team with you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I had a question that was kind of practically oriented around rent and housing. When refugee families are placed, is there some consideration to sort of an apartment that's within walking distance to the town center and or a federally qualified health center or somewhere where they can, like, I'm assuming that that's, if it's available, that you would aim for that. And then as part of that, is there any success with advocating for discounted rent with landlords, almost as a charitable contribution that they could write off, and that's something that we could help support?
Amy, do you want to?
Sure. So walkability, access to public transportation, these are key considerations. You know, you just can't place, you know, so we did get offers of housing, especially after the Afghan crisis, you know, and some of it's like way up in the, you know, northern Westchester and not close to anything. And we can't put a family there because it's not close to public transportation. So that's definitely an issue. We also are looking for low rents. The lower rent, the better, so that the family can get towards self-sufficiency. So that's an issue. Another issue is finding landlords that are willing to rent to somebody who has no credit history. So even though Hearts and Homes or in a volunteer team outside of Hearts and Homes, they might have an individual that serves as a guarantor. In our case, the organization serves as a guarantor, but still not every landlord is excited about that or excited about housing refugees or any of that. So you know, you kind of have to find the right person. We don't normally find anyone that will discount rent. That would be a rare find. We're happy just when they're willing to rent to refugees and have a good price with a decent, you know, a place that's nice and livable, you know.
Yeah, and that's another area where the networking has really helped, because when any one group identifies the landlord who is open to a guarantor and to having our new neighbors, then we share that so that anybody can speak to, you know, anybody could reach out to them and say, do you have an apartment for us at this point? Any other questions? I'm a teacher. I'm supposed to be able to handle wait time.
It doesn't sound like it, unless. Nope. Okay. But yeah, really, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us tonight. I think this was really helpful. So thank you. We appreciate it. And yeah, I think we'll have to discuss internally and drum up support and and then come back with what we think we can do. But I'm encouraged by what you were saying, Amy, that you know, there's lots of varying levels of need, and if we can find something that fits, hopefully.
One more, just note, like I mentioned, my church is relatively small, and we've chosen to also, like some of us invited our friends to be participating in this. So while it is through our church that we have our refugee support team, we also, it's a way to engage other people with our church, even, to say like, hey, this is what we're doing. So it's fine if somebody doesn't go to our church, but it's a friend of somebody on the team and they want to receive our emails and participate on the team, and that's absolutely fine. That's your call. But I just want to mention that as another possibility for building support for this.
Or finding a partner congregation. If there's another congregation in the area that you've already done some things with, and you might offer this to them also. We have our group is actually a group of interfaith congregations, but we have a number of people that are called unaffiliated. They're not a member of any congregation, but they heard about it through a member and they wanted to join the effort. So yeah.
If questions pop up for us, just as we consider or continue to discuss and consider, what would be the best way, or who should we kind of direct those questions to?
Well, you have mine and Kathy's email address, so I think, just reaching back out to us is absolutely fine. And I don't know if Jane, if you want to put your email address also in the chat in case anybody has something specific that they would like to get in touch with you about. We are happy to, if I'm not the right person for the question, I can forward it to Jane or whatever, we're happy to answer questions.
Perfect. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for inviting us, and it's great to see all of you here on this call. It's exciting to think about, building the support for our new neighbors. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. It was great.
For those from New Hope, I am posting a link in the chat for a survey that we've been having people fill out from the church if they're interested in helping or learning more. So if you haven't filled out the survey yet and you'd like to, that'd be helpful in just helping us collect this information. And yeah, thanks again, Amy and Jane, and we'll hopefully be in touch soon.
Good. Thank you. Good night.
Have a great evening.
You too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.